Okay. So it is 2:31, so I'm going to go ahead and start this panel. Thank you for joining today. This panel is titled Education, Equity, and Philanthropy's Role, and we have 4 amazing panelists and an amazing moderator here today to talk about K-12 education, equity, and sort of philanthropy's role in sort of the issues of education today. Yes. So I am going to start off by introducing our moderator, Charisse Ward. Charisse currently is the portfolio director at the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, where she oversees the deployment of investments in K-12 education programs. Previously, she has worked as the Chief of Staff and Strategy for the Division of Human Capital at the New York City Department of Education, and also as a Special Assistant in the Office of the Superintendent at New York Public Schools. Charisse is an alum of Education Pioneers, the Broad Residency in Urban Education, and the Council of Urban Professionals Fellowship. So I'd like to give a warm welcome to Charisse and our panelists today, and I hope you all enjoy this panel. Charisse.
Great. Okay, thank you so much for the warm introduction. I'm so excited to be here among this very distinguished group of education leaders, and I'm really looking forward to having a rich discussion today. I want to start out with some brief introductions, and then we will jump right into our conversation. So Heather, would you mind kicking us off?
I don't know. It just stopped working. Got it.
Heather, are you able to hear us? Okay, we're gonna jump right over to Natalie, and then we'll come back to Heather.
Hi, my name is Natalie. I am a partner at New Schools Venture Fund, leading our racial equity team, where we are both interested in ideas that are led by leaders of color that are advancing racial equity in education, and where we're piloting, and we've been working with doing participatory grant making and engaging a council of students, parents, innovators around the country to decide not only the criteria about who we fund, but then make those final decisions and allocate the funding on our behalf. And so I've just been at New Schools for 2.5 years. And when I first joined New Schools, part of what motivated me to be a member of the team is just the focus that we had on Black and Latino leadership and diversifying the education workforce on our diverse leaders strategy. I come to this work as both the daughter of a retired math educator who advocated on my behalf, and a single mother to an 11-year-old middle school Black girl who is, it's so hard to describe her. Charisse knows her as well, but just truly pure joy. And, I am constantly saying that I do this work to find and invest and support others who can create a more equitable future for her to thrive.
Thanks, Natalie. Let me pass it over to Jean-Claude.
Thanks, Charisse. Good afternoon, everyone. Maybe some good mornings in the audience. For me, it's good morning. I'm in California. I am the president and CEO of a global nonprofit called Digital Promise. Spent the last 3.5, 4 years at the Gates Foundation, working with school systems and communities, frankly, in 4 states around the U.S., Texas, Tennessee, New York, and Washington State. I'm also a former large city school superintendent. Chicago was my last district. Before that, Rochester, New York, I had and of course, spent about 22 plus years in New York City public schools.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jean-Claude. Sherman.
Good afternoon, everyone. Sherman White, hailing from Kansas City. I've spent the last 5 years at the Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation on the education team as Director of Programs and Community Engagement. Previously, I was at the Walton Family Foundation for about 6 years on their K-12 education teams as well. I, too, am an alum of the Broad Residency in Urban Education, which is now located at the Yale School of Management. And before that, I had a corporate career. I was an engineer and a marketer. and somehow fell into education. It's a pleasure to be here.
Fantastic. And then Heather, I'm hoping, and I think we've resolved the tech issues. Would love to hear from you.
I'm so sorry about that. Hi, everyone. I'm Heather Inequities. I'm the CEO of the Chicago Public Education Fund, which is a nonprofit, place-based venture philanthropy organization that's been in Chicago for about 2 decades. I have been leading the fund through 8 Chicago Public Schools CEOs. Jean-Claude was my first CEO in this role. Proud to have supported lots of great people in that spot. Our work is primarily focused on leadership, principal leadership specifically, and a variety of programs that support the great leaders that are in the 640 schools across Chicago. I'm really excited to be here with y'all today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Heather. Before I jump in, I just want to kind of frame up the conversation and share with you all sort of the arc of what we're hoping to accomplish today. As the title suggests, right, we're here to talk about equity and philanthropy's role specific to K-12 education. So I'd love if we could sort of start the conversation at the intersection of the pandemic and the racial inequities that we've seen. Kind of think about the role of philanthropy in addressing some of those things that we're seeing, and then kind of move us to talk about innovation and where we see opportunity given the place that we're in. And then I think the biggest at the biggest picture, highest level, thinking about like what should the future of education evolve into given everything that we're learning in this moment. So the first question that I have, and this is for the full group so anyone can jump in, what impact do you believe the pandemic has had on the racial inequities that have been, I think from my seat, pretty longstanding in K-12 education?
I'm happy to jump in. This is something we studied quite a bit when I was at the Gates Foundation and looking at what was happening nationally and what was happening locally. But just focusing on what people love, I guess a lot is data. When you look at data for 13-year-olds in math and literacy, we've recorded the first drop since 1970s. And what we're seeing too is that the drops are happening with kids of color, poor kids of color, not white sort of middle income or upper income students, which is suggesting that the gap is getting wider, not actually shrinking. The second, when you look at trauma and what is happening, frankly, in communities across the U.S., especially in those most impacted, again, communities of color, we're seeing in the trauma, effects of trauma to be overrepresented, frankly, in parts of our communities, and especially those who are Black, brown, and poor or indigenous. So clearly, we have a crisis, frankly, in looking at both the academic and non-academic development of young people. In many ways, we've gone back decades, particularly the efforts we put moving forward.
Thank you, Jean-Claude. Would others like to comment on that first question? All right. Great, Sherman.
I'm a Southerner, so I was waiting for the ladies to go first. I would just say that it exposed what we already knew, but perhaps didn't want to fully acknowledge, which was some of these inequities around digital, inequities around housing security, food. We spent the first part of the pandemic in Kansas City using our grant dollars to feed students. There were so many students who depended on school and being in school for their meals, right? So that sometimes that was the only meal they got. And we learned that we had teachers that didn't have internet. So you're asking teachers to do remote schooling, and they didn't even have internet access, right? And one of our school districts, for a few months, they were missing. They couldn't identify where 2,000+ students were. So expose all types of digital as well as non-digital inequities that already existed, but for whatever reason, we just decided not to prioritize and address.
Thank you, Sherman.
Exactly what I was going to say. It's like we knew this was happening, but now it's really like laid bare. I think the only thing I'd add to that is also the implications that it's had for human capital within districts and within schools. And so seeing so many vacancies and just there were already gaps that existed in terms of representation in teachers of color and school leaders of color. And we're starting to see implications for whether that might widen and who's in the classroom, who's teaching our children. And so just curious on like how that will continue to evolve with the pandemic. And then lastly, this idea of parent engagement and like how do you, I think it's sort of laid bare even more how many schools were not engaging parents in the way that was productive and really partnering with them around their child's learning. And now we're kind of forced to, particularly in the early mark of the pandemic when we were all at home. And I was becoming both a at-home teacher at the same time as like trying to keep things moving at work. So I just wanted to reflect on those 2 points.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Heather.
Yeah, I mean, building on the human capital point, which is sort of where we spend most of our time, I think there will be shortages and difficulties at the pipeline, on the pipeline side, especially around making sure that we have, in the case of Chicago, Latinx and Black leaders in front of our students. But I am worried about the people who are there and staying. Satisfaction is the lowest we've seen it. We measure satisfaction here in Chicago of our principals, and it's lower than we've seen in a long time. The burden that's been placed, particularly on Black leaders and Latino leaders in the system, is huge. And they're in their mid-40s. They're probably going to stay in many cases. Their kids are enrolled in the system. They're probably going to stay. And we have real work, I think, to do to provide the kind of support, trauma-informed support for those adults that will be required if we want them to stay and do the kind of innovation types of efforts that we have traditionally seen come from educators across systems like Chicago.
Heather, thank you for that reflection. I was actually going to head in that direction and wanted to ask if we could just say, if you could offer some additional thoughts on, just from a school district perspective, talent in our talent pipelines, we know is something that we're going to, I think, be dealing with for a number of years to come. But I'm curious about this around sort of technology shortages and some of the things that others elevated. What were some of the particular sort of pain points, if I can frame it in that way, that Chicago experienced?
Early on in the pandemic, we saw many of the same pain points other folks did around the basics that school provides. So technology was one piece, getting technology in the hands of every kid and family, internet in the hands of every kid and family. The mayor and an organization here called Kids First Chicago did really great work to try and increase access very rapidly. But food distribution and logistical challenges along those lines really took a lot of the energy from people, even as they were managing, to Natalie's point, their own kids suddenly at home, and all of the fears that were, we didn't have, it's hard to remember now, right? But there were no vaccines. It was a very different early stage here. And I think for Chicago, that persisted for a pretty long time. So you could fix the internet problem as an example, but the challenge of quiet, supportive space for learning, in my house, I have 4 kids, was very hard to find. And in the houses across Chicago, very hard to find in many cases. And so principals and their teacher teams had to be so creative with what it was that they were putting out there. And that took so much energy. And we just haven't had a break since then. Every new stage has required new kinds of energy and pivots. And we haven't, we talk a lot with our principals about filling the bucket, right? We just haven't had the chance to fill their buckets in any meaningful way. And I think the next 6 to 18 months are going to continue to present those challenges as we start to look at both the social, emotional, and the academic gaps that Jean-Claude was mentioning in his opening comments.
Sure, can I just quickly add to what Heather just talked about, which I think is really important. one thing we saw, for example, in parts of the Seattle communities or King County, in parts of Washington State, there was large refugee populations, frankly, who didn't have the luxury or choice of working at home, who had children in schools. Schools had closed. One of the districts in King County was the first one to actually shut down. I think it was March 2020. So when you have African refugees who have to go to work in the hotels, have to go to work who are in the gig economy, you got children at home, it presented, frankly, a challenge for those folks that didn't exist before. So there's some innovation there too. I saw the housing authority communities come together to support each other, but that was hugely disruptive, frankly, for a lot of poor parents who didn't have the luxury, again, many parts of Chicago, of staying home and working from home.
No, I appreciate that additional reflection, and I think you're putting a fine point on the ways in which community schools are parts of community. And so when students are out of school and parents' lives are disrupted in the way that they've been, there does have to be a full community response to ensure that students and their families are supported. With that in mind, and I think with sort of Heather's kind of time frame in mind of that, like next 6 to 18 months into the future, I'm really curious to hear from you all about how your organizations are thinking about, through sort of obviously a philanthropic lens, how are they thinking about supporting the racial inequities that have been exacerbated during this period of time. We'll get to the innovations. I'll hold up on the innovations for the moment, but would love to just hear, like, how are your organizations thinking about responding and supporting to the challenges that are before us?
I'll jump in on this one. One of the things that we're excited about and that just launched this week is we have a really open, broad funding opportunity. If you've been following New Schools, you know that we have some very distinct strategies, that we fund new schools, we fund efforts to diversify the education workforce, we fund tools and content, but we also realize that, like, in order to really achieve educational equity, there's other ideas out there that might fall beyond the limits of kind of what we think are going to be impactful. And so we have this open call out right now to find that innovation and to fund folks who have bold ideas that might not fit within our unique strategies, and the ideas that do and are really innovative as well. And so I think the way that we've approached this is to say that we're just more open to figuring out how do we tackle this big problem, knowing that, like, we don't have the solution, but we want to fund and partner and support folks who might.
Would love to hear from others, but Natalie, I'd love, what I hear you saying is proximate leadership matters, and I think understanding the role of philanthropy in a slightly more nuanced way is really important, I think, for the future of the sector. Would others like to respond in just in terms of how their organizations are supporting?
The Kauffman Foundation has refreshed its vision, its mission, its investment priorities during this time of COVID, multiple pandemics. We revised processes, both internal and external. As an example, we didn't collect demographic data of our grantees and our applicants prior to even measure. So a lot of that's just an example. We're streamlining application processes. In some cases, we are working hand in hand with intermediary organizations to make the access to the dollars easier. We've increased grant making and capacity building initiatives among leaders of color, and I personally am leading a racial equity community of practice with 14 other external partners and grantees of ours region-wide, kind of grappling with the issues of the region together. So just a few examples come to mind of things Kauffman is doing. We have BIPOC impact goals now. So one of the challenges, you didn't ask for a challenge, but one of the challenges is you're talking about BIPOC and you've got it in your strategy, but what data do we have on Indigenous people, let alone grants, right? We underfund a section of the city, and it's predominated by a Latinx population. So we've got some gaps we've got to close there, but I'm really proud of the work that we've done so far in the last 2 to 3 years This was pre-George Floyd. We started this racial equity journey. It was accelerant. The Floyd incident was accelerant, and COVID was accelerant. But I'm really happy about the journey we've been on, and it's up to people like us in philanthropy to keep pushing to make sure that the work doesn't become performative or box checking, but it actually is sustained over time.
We double click on a couple of those pieces in terms of what we've been doing here in Chicago. I think really early on in the pandemic, we worked with a broad range of other philanthropy to put together a COVID comeback fund. We've always believed at the fund that it's the people on the ground leading in schools that make the best decisions about what communities need in partnership with their communities. And so these were small grants that went out to school leaders and their teams and their communities to try and solve some of those, less tangible, right? Like I said, you can solve the internet problem, but how do you start to think about some of those more relational challenges? And we saw some really remarkable steps forward. What we learned in that process was that people needed more time together and support in looking at data, in having empathetic conversations, and in designing what would come next. So we've doubled down on those efforts and run a set of design workshops and supports for principals across the city to bring in their teams, to bring in their parents, to have those kinds of empathetic conversations, and to continue to iterate on what's going to help in the current conditions. And I think that aspect of time and space is something that philanthropy can often buy and provide in a way that an individual school leader or even a district, and even with federal funds, might be struggling to do in a way that feels authentic and true to the work of the community.
I can add a bit to everyone's push, and there's so many things that happened at Gates when the pandemic hit. Some of it very local, Cherise, some of it typically national and global. For example, we kept looking in the intersection of health and education. There we doubled down and looked at HBCUs and health organizations in working together to help those universities reopen. So that was a big part of the effort. Part of my portfolio included, again, looking at community sort of wide efforts. For example, we were doing work in Dallas, in the Rio Grande Valley, in Chattanooga, in Buffalo, and we kept trying to support these sort of holistic approaches to the challenges, right? So it was a school issue, it was a community issue. So we kept trying to sort of inject funding and support in parts. Again, having had a DNA of looking at the P16 or PWP, the workforce continuum, not just the K-12, and we can come back to that a bit later on, and how we saw the gap. So lots of examples around there in supporting orgs like Chiefs for Change, CCSSO, and others. We were supporting systems. For example, we're part of a funded collaborative with CZI, Schusterman, and others in really supporting a set of guidance and supporting guidance for the chief state school officers to support school districts. What we did very concretely in Washington State was to take that guidance, sit with about maybe a dozen school districts, and workshop very specifically what they needed. And to Heather's point, the idea of room to think and room in technical support, and we begin to hire TNCP, ANET, a bunch of organizations to say, look, how can you help pick the district, Seattle Public Schools or Renton Public Schools, and then we'll give you a 7-figure contract to support this systems leader, and really thinking about both the intersection of learning, sort of interrupted learning, and the social emotional support of young people. But you guys go ahead and design what is best and co-construct with this particular systems leader. So all that, I guess, really helped push the conversation. But to be more sort of also step back a bit, it began to even begin to question our own strategies, whether or not we were really focusing on the first and the second pandemic in a way that was going to be meaningful to community. So it was a bit of a rejiggering of every single strategy at the foundation, and really stepping back and saying, okay, what are we doing? Are we doing the right thing? And in some cases, we call some things non-viable and just dropped it, or give folks a sort of a runway off. But in some cases, we just doubled down on particular initiatives.
Jean-Claude, I love that. I really do love that. And I think it speaks to, I think, the power of philanthropy to be responsive in these critical moments. And I think what I hear you saying is we are working along a spectrum, right? And so we're thinking about ecosystem level investments and supports that can impact things that are happening on the ground, while also not losing sight of the support that folks need on the ground in their day-to-day. And I wanted to just kind of like take that a step further and kind of go back to something that Heather mentioned around ESSER funds. You know, for those, there's been a lot of conversation about federal stimulus, and you know, I think folks in some ways are they see this big dollar sign, 122 billion, I think is the number. And shouldn't this solve the problem? Shouldn't this, you know, this infusion of capital really help districts go, you know, get out of the challenges that we're facing right now? But I want to talk a little bit about like the limitations that you all see of federal stimulus and where philanthropy is uniquely positioned to play a role in response to the things that have happened in the pandemic, but then also thinking about, this is going to segue into innovation, what needs to exist in the sector that currently doesn't. And I think we've sort of at the outset kind of talked about the things that have been brought to the forefront. So would love if we could kind of take the conversation in that direction and kind of talk about what's philanthropy's unique role in thinking about it relative to federal dollars and investments.
I mean, I'll start. You know, I've been part of a funded collaborative organized by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, which has been really amazing. Laverne Srinivasan and Saskia Levy been with Jen Halloran's support, been really running these. We're still meeting, even though I'm not exactly in philanthropy anymore. I've stayed a part of those conversations. And for example, this week we're talking with Mark Sternberg and others about A Street Ventures, what is happening in the tech sector, and what is the role of philanthropy in really pushing that discussion forward. But those kinds of collaboratives, many of them born of the pandemic, really help 40, 50 of us to step back and say, what is our role in really pushing this discussion forward? And at times listening to community, listening to practitioners, folks who are on the front line and say, what are you doing? How can we best support? If we are a national funder, what is a local funder doing? So what is the community foundation in, I don't know, Kansas City, Missouri doing? And how can we support that kind of organization who are frankly on the ground, on the front line, kinds of effort? And again, asking some of the big questions. But to your specific question, and I'll give you an answer I gave to New York One News. I was in New York a few months ago talking to David Banks, and we both interviewed with New York One. And they asked, so what do you bring to David Banks, the new chancellor of New York City Public Schools? I said, look, in a couple of weeks, he's about to be inundated with work and stress. What I have is room to think, room to support him and provide that kind of extra capacity in stepping back and seeing the systemic needs and supporting him in that kind of way. The money is nice from a funder, but it is not really game changing, right? But what is game changing is how a funder can catalyze the larger pot of money coming from the federal government to solve very entrenched and difficult challenges you may find in the school system.
Be really brief because I'm not as knowledgeable on innovation as Jean-Claude, but we need to leverage philanthropic funding with federal funding around broadband, around internet access. The pandemic forced us into a digital learning space where most of us either didn't embrace it initially or still haven't embraced it, and we're kind of watching the clock to go back to in person. Instead of taking this as an opportunity to really figure out how to create a digital learning spaces and have them be impactful from an academic outcomes perspective.
I think that's such a good example of sort of one of the technical challenges that philanthropy can help solve. You know, really technically stepping in to help a system think about how do we solve against broadband, or a city think about how do we solve against broadband, and the adaptive aspects of it. So how do we help families who are worried that when their kid is on a computer they're not really learning understand what's happening in that dynamic? How do we help educators who, you know, I think of I taught a long time ago, who have become dependent on certain tools, make that switch, even as they're dealing with the continued trauma of COVID-19. So I think philanthropy can play a role both on the technical strategic side and on the adaptive, supporting the adults all around schools in making those kinds of transitions. I also just want to call out the difference between the local place-based philanthropy and those national folks Jean-Claude was talking about. We run a community of practice with a lot of local place-based philanthropic organizations. We learn a ton from all the folks that Jean-Claude was mentioning. And it is those local philanthropy organizations that have the relationships to understand the unique business case of every district or system. And so how, as local funders, do we think about the actual business case of our system in that larger national context, but in a way that moves the technical and adaptive needs forward of our place? It's a really interesting time to put those pieces together and to help people walk forward.
And Heather, I'm curious, are you seeing more of these integrated partnerships emerging and being forged in this particular moment relative to what you've seen in the past?
I'm definitely seeing people lean in a lot faster. I think because all of us were stuck in this new place, right? So my experience, like with the other folks that we're working with, is that all of us felt a little bit over our skis. Mm-hmm. We wanted to be helpful. We wanted to continue to do the things we thought we knew worked, but we wanted to take the opportunity to relook at the work we were doing in meaningful ways. And the time kind of demanded it. And I'm seeing a lot more, I don't know if y'all are seeing this nationally, but locally, like much more willingness to just share. You know, especially in the context of the federal dollars, there's plenty of money to go around if the idea is a good one. But making sure that it is not only a good idea, but has the technical aspects that we talked about and the adaptive aspects that we talked about is really hard work. And so sharing that kind of information across organizations seems to be much more, acceptable than maybe it was 5 years ago.
Thank you. Natalie, did you have anything to add here? If not, I want to kind of think about innovations in teaching and learning.
I think the only piece I'd add, it's similar to what Heather shared, and I think we are just looking at it from a national perspective. And so the communities of practice that we hold are like bringing districts and folks together from across the country so that they can actually partner and think, oh, what are you doing there in Chicago? Great, like that's something I can leverage. And so I think the role we can play is both providing that unrestricted capital and allowing leaders the space to decide how and when to use those funds for what, and then bringing folks together and providing that like management assistance and partnership support to help them think through what's the best way for us to deploy capital, and the strategy behind it.
Sharice, before you go to your next question, just want to go back to what Chairman mentioned earlier and what Heather's talked about a little bit as well too. When we think about the broadband issues and device issues, etc., and think about sort of philanthropic support, let's not just think about the typical national funders. I'm going to put a link in the chat. One of the biggest programs really for us at Digital Promise and for nearly 600 schools, 400,000 kids come from Verizon, where they spend about $40 million a year. And they've been doing this for 5 years, well before the pandemic, pushing one-to-one technology. But what's important here is that the focus is not on devices and broadband necessarily, is on the digital learning gap. How do you leverage technology to improve teaching and learning? What these schools love the most, frankly, is the access to the coaching that is given to teachers, etc. So let's think about private corporations and what they need to do, frankly, to support this kind of effort.
Yeah, well, let's stay there because that's exactly where I was going, Jean-Claude, around innovations in digital learning, right? So I think, Sherman, you had sort of mentioned there was this moment, I think, where many were feeling like, okay, we're 2 or 3 months out or 6 months out from going back, right? The reflex to go back has been so strong. And I think, if we've learned anything during this time is we cannot predict the future. And I don't know that any of us, certainly I was at the Department of Education, New York City at the time. And I remember saying, I'll see you in a few weeks, right? And so here I am now, 2 years later, nearly in a very, very different world. So when we think about innovations for digital learning, and our students are still in many districts have some access to access and opportunity to receive a virtual education. I'm just curious to hear your all's thoughts on, the role that you see philanthropy play in helping to stand up new innovations around teaching and learning, particularly for our most marginalized students, for our Black and Latino students, and those who are furthest from opportunity. I'm just really curious about where you see sort of the sector heading, and what's philanthropy's role to help, I don't know if it will quickly get us there, but get us to what we're all hoping will be a brighter future for K-12 education.
I have a ton to say here, Sharice, but I'm going to let my colleagues go first. Mr. Chairman, I talk way too much, so I want to step back for a second.
Not at all.
I feel like I'm being repetitive, so I'll be brief, but I still believe our role is to find, fund, and support innovators out there. Ideally, those who are closest to the problem, those who have the ideas that are in their communities, right? And then just like step out the way. I don't think that's what's happening. And I think in some ways it's like, how are we measuring our success? Like, what are we holding ourselves accountable to? And so I'm excited to be at New Schools, where we're constantly tracking how many leaders of color that we are supporting. And that's a huge priority for us. And then also thinking of different ways of bringing others into the decision-making pool to be the ones to decide like what's needed within their communities. And to be the ones to say, this is what we want to fund. And then for us to then partner with those folks and support them. And that's something we've been doing in our racial equity strategy in particular. I think in addition to that, it's like I tell people all the time, I'm not the visionary. I'm not the innovator. I don't have the idea. So it's really about like, how do we fund those folks and just step out the way?
Cheers, I'm happy to unleash a little bit and give Heather and Sherman some time to think. I want to put a few links in the chat and get into, because that has been a passion for me, frankly, this past number of years, looking at what is happening, frankly, in the black box, right? In the teaching and learning, which when you look at the gap you opened with, has to be looked at expansively, right? Typically, when we look at the achievement gap, we look at math and literacy scores. If I were to paint for you a picture of a child's journey through the education system or systems, from pre-K, say, through post-secondary, it's a terrifying construct to actually watch. There's a funneling effect that happens. For example, I'll pick one state on the West Coast, not California, but every state in the nation has the same narrative. You take every child who's proficient in reading at third grade and you move them through the system. And in one state, the post-secondary completion, 2 and 4 years, 25% for all kids, 11 to 12% for kids of color. Every kid is proficient. It's a massive attrition. If our goal in life is to make sure young people have access to personal agency, well-being, economic security, you need a post-secondary education. Not need college, but you need post-secondary education to get there. The fact is we're not getting our kids there. So the gap is so much more powerful, or terrifying, maybe is the right word, when you look at that. But stepping back from how you think about that, for me, it's both in terms of what is happening within our school, within our system, what is happening across systems. So yeah, we can talk about all the adjacent systems, but I'll leave that alone for a second. So one example of something funded by the Oak Foundation, CZI, God and others, is called the Learner Variability Project, where this is personalization on steroids, where leveraging technology, leveraging the understanding of child development. So learning science, for example, you can get very concrete about supporting teachers and what they do in the classroom. This particular project gets about 10,000 educator hits a month. And we're finding that folks are using it from South Africa, from Australia, from the Philippines, and from the US, but again, catalyzed by the Oak Foundation, supported by the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. So a really powerful piece. Another, frankly, when you take a look at this whole idea of inclusive innovation is another construct which we need to keep talking about, which is that you co-create with community. I think both Heather and Natalie may have mentioned this, right? You empower, or you don't go to a city or community and say, we have a solution for you. But instead, they're part of the design, they're part of the identification of the challenge and the problem, then you design appropriately. Funders have to get to that place to really respect the context experts that we have within our midst that we often frankly ignore. But there's so much happening right now in technology, or potentially for technology to transform what we do. I'll give you a concrete example. Quill, a nonprofit edtech company, is working on an amazing platform around writing that will relieve the teacher of the minutia of having to write every score writing assessments to allow kids to write more. And by the way, there are orgs in Chicago, Heather would tell you about, who are doing very similar work, again, supported by the Gates Foundation and others, frankly, Overdeck and others, frankly, who are doing this kind of work in supporting really amazing teaching and learning innovations in our classroom. Last thing I'll say before I start talking, two things quickly. One is that learning management systems have become ubiquitous because of the pandemic. How do we keep that forever? Parents now have a view of the pedagogy and the curriculum in the classrooms. My hope is that they don't give that up. LMS is a really good way of doing that. In Northwestern University is taking very deliberately, working with a few folks, curriculum associates included, try to figure out how you mine that kind of data field to really better support the teaching and learning in our classroom. Last big thing, frankly, which is the National Science Foundation, another funder, I think is doing a lot of work, is around artificial intelligence, how that can actually transform what we do. But there's a danger around bias, there's a danger about a bunch of different things we have to mitigate. So funders can catalyze that kind of understanding. So as these companies, or both for-profit, non-profit, are building their guardrails around what they should not do for kids who are kids of color or underrepresented in our system. And so lots we can talk about here, but there's a lot happening in the field right now.
That's all incredibly exciting to hear. I think, Heather, you're going to jump in.
Well, I have nothing on innovation. Jean-Claude's sort of way of thinking about that is so much more sophisticated than mine, for sure. But one of the things that we have learned in doing a lot of the design and partnership work that we've done is that innovation can only happen at the speed of trust. So no matter how good the idea is, no matter how bought in the leader is, no matter how excited everyone who's on the design team might be, the work can only happen at the speed that the students and the families and the community can lean into and be a part of. And one thing I think philanthropy can do is to destigmatize that. So you will always have people on like the outer edges who are just amazing trust builders and can do all the cool things. We have a couple of schools like that here in Chicago, and they, way before the pandemic, through the pandemic, and right now are doing cutting edge, amazing work. Those folks will always exist. But if we're really interested in moving the middle 60% toward all of the remarkable innovation Jean-Claude just mentioned, we as philanthropy, I think, can normalize the importance of relationship building and change management in that context. And, Natalie mentioned the communities of practice that they run, and those have been so powerful for leaders in Chicago who have participated, because it helps people see, oh, it's not just me. I'm not the only one who's really struggling with that. And it gives people safe space to think about that, to hear from each other, and to continue to move forward. So we think a lot about how do we create that space and use our dollars in order to normalize that process.
And then Sherman, anything to add there? No, okay. All right, so I want to begin to kind of wrap us up and move us into the Q&A portion with the last 15 minutes that we have. But I do have, I guess, one final kind of whip around question around like the future of education. What do you all see is missing what are the limitations? I think we've talked a lot about what the problem is. And so if we have a framing of the problem, we have a framing of an approach from our respective seats and organizations and our peer organizations. And we have sort of a vision for what we want to have happen and to see in the future for our students and families. But what's missing? What's getting in the way? What are the barriers that we're still up against in this sector? And I think I'd want to end on a more optimistic note. And so what are you hopeful for relative to what those limitations are? What do you see as the path through?
I'll jump in. Thank you first of all, thank you for this panel, and thank you for the question, Cherise. I think that we philanthropy, we society, we need to leverage these past 2+ years as a portal into a new way of thinking and behaving. I think it's an opportunity for us to create new boundaries. We talked about some of the innovations earlier. It's also an opportunity to set new expectations for teachers, for students, for policymakers. People are clamoring to get back to normal when it's very clear to those who look at the data that normal was not serving a large swath of our population. Why are we clamoring to get back to something that wasn't working instead of using this as an opportunity to kind of reimagine it and refocus our efforts on what could be versus what was? And I think that's the opportunity that lies before us. We can take it or not take it, but philanthropy is the risk capital, is the catalytic capital that should be driving this conversation. Sometimes philanthropy is the most risk averse. And we've got to get out of that mindset and use this capital as catalytic capital so that we can start creating new innovations and exploring what the opportunities are. Okay, I'll be quiet. Thank you.
I totally agree with that, Sherman. I think it was really well put. I think that we can be risk capital, and we can see the places that are kind of boring that need to be dealt with if we're going to help remove some of those barriers. I'll give a simple example. Carnegie units, the way that we manage high school credits, the way that we think about grades. First graders are 7, second graders, all of those aspects, which are mostly in Illinois managed by state policy. Those are things that philanthropy can look at and say, these are standing in the way of our educators innovating in the way that they want and need to, and can support organizations that will advocate for at least, pilot programs and innovation zones and spaces where people can do the work of taking apart those structures that have held kids and communities and schools back for so long. So I think it is exciting to think about philanthropy, in the acceleration and catalytic space. And I think philanthropy has a role to play going forward in the more boring space, and where we can push in and just provide the support to knock down the barriers that the people on the ground are sharing with us in real and maybe lasting ways.
Nadia, happy to go after you.
Sherman took all my points. I mean, I just was over here snapping. Like, yes. I think truly, that's it. We provide risk capital, and we at times are afraid to take those risks. And I think the fear I have and the hope as well is just there are ways in which philanthropy has exacerbated some of the inequities that exist. Right? If you look at where dollars flow, there are ways in which more dollars have flown, continue to flow to white leaders in this work who are far removed from the students that we serve in many cases. And so how do we reroute that? And how do we fix that and hold ourselves accountable to it? And yes, I think that's a question in the chat too, of how do we do more auditing of where our dollars are going, and finding, I think this myth that those ideas aren't out there and those leaders of colors aren't out there, and we know that they are, and they're doing the work in their communities. So just finding them, funding them, partnering with them.
I agree. I mean, this idea of really getting close to the folks who are doing the work and having them be the arbiter and the creator, I think is an important sort of pivot. The one thing I'll push is that the work doesn't have to be boring, right? It can be really exciting when you're looking forward. To give you a couple of examples of places where I think there is really amazing opportunity. One is the idea of looking at the student learner record. It is antiquated, it is one-dimensional, does not really capture all learning. You think about competency-based assessments, you think about micro badges, etc. You think about the transition. There are a number of people, including IMS Global and others, the Commit Partnership in Dallas, who are working on really reinventing the vessel from which we actually hold and pushing the agency and ownership to the student. And not to the institutions, but to the student, right? That I think can revolutionize how we think about K-12 to post-secondary to workforce, including the U.S. Chamber was on this, Walmart is on this, etc. So aligned to that, I think the area of assessment is ripe for innovation, and there are folks again working on this. Most recently, been talking to a professor at UMass who's launching the Center for Assessment Justice. You think about what that is, right? It gets to things like context-based assessment, where and we've demonstrated that if you give a child assessment along the lines of something they really care about, the reading scores can jump as high as 2 grade levels. Right now, what we have is equally boring to it's basically disengage every single student. Last one I'll push as an area of innovation, we walked away from many years ago as funders. We have to get back to is one of talent and leadership. The teacher shortage, the exodus of leadership is not new, it has a long tail. The head of the NEA has been talking about this. This problem has been around. My fear is that what you see happening in Michigan will permeate the country, where they're allowing folks without credentials to be going in front of our classrooms because of a desperation. So talent, what we used to fund, a bunch of us used to fund, we all walked away from it. We have to get back to really supporting our schools through talent.
I'm going to bring back Reiko to help pivot us into Q&A. I just want to thank you all so much for the time, for your energy, for your brilliance. What a rich conversation. And Reiko? I think we've got you on mute. Oh. Reiko, you're muted.
Sorry. I was saying thank you so much, Charisse, Heather, Sherman, Jean-Claude, and Natalie for this amazing conversation discussion. I'm looking in the Q&A box, and I think we have a few in here. I'll start off with the most recent one, but here you go. So thinking about the idea of tracking how our dollars are creating impact, what are some impact measurement strategies that the sector can take into consideration to measure the impact that you're actually making in this education space?
Looking at each other like, who's going to take this one? I can share a bit about how we think about it at New Schools. And I think this is an area that the fields, we all need to do more on. But I don't want it to, I think there's moments where it doesn't allow for us to take risks, because for a lot of the early stage organizations we support, they don't yet have some of this data. And it's about being patient and like waiting to see those results a few years in. And I think that can be really challenging for philanthropy at times. But we do collect and track data on how our students are performing in the schools that we fund. For the talent innovations that we fund, we're looking to see, are teachers actually staying in the classroom? Or is there retention for teachers and leaders of color? What are the recruitment numbers? How many teachers and leaders of color are flowing into the system based on the innovations that we're supporting there? And I think it really varies based on what you're funding. And it's something that with each of our strategies, we develop a logic model. We think through what are the what is it that we want to see for students, and then how will our work help to get us there. But it is very long term, and so that's just just at a high level.
I'll try to be brief. I have two quick thoughts. One, on the short-term measurement of impact, I like to say you want to make sure a philanthropy's narrative, their rhetoric, their logic model matches their actual portfolio. At the end of the day, we're grant-making institutions, right? You can talk about BIPOC and leaders of color, and you could have this storytelling narrative, which I call marketing, right? And then you look at the portfolio, and the evidence isn't there, right? Whether it be the number of leaders of color, whether it be proximate to communities, because it doesn't have to be leaders of color. If you're going to invest in a community, you should be investing in leaders that are proximate to that community, even if it's rural white, right? So oftentimes we just have this lens of leaders of color, but no matter what the community, where's the approximation to that community? And then on the longitudinal side, because most of these foundations have been around for generations, right? So we can measure things. I cut my teeth as a Brody in New Orleans, right? We talked about post-Katrina. We talked about an entire charter system, high quality schools. We even coined a term, quality seats, right? And we started measuring longitudinally academic progress. But in a city, in a place-based strategy, how do you know if you've had academic progress and real academic outcomes? You should start seeing longitudinal changes in crime, in median household income, in employment rates. There are ways, there's economic indicators to measure all of the longitudinal outcomes of things that we claim to be impacting on a daily, weekly, monthly, annual basis. Over time, if you have a sustained investment, you should be seeing macro level indicators change. And if not, that means your strategy isn't as robust as you were claiming it to be.
Rika, do we have time for one more question?
Yes, I think so. So one more question. Do you consider putting resources towards generating legislative change?
I'm happy to be quick on this one. At Gates, we had a full division, actually two divisions. One focusing on global advocacy, as nonprofit funders can't lobby. So global advocacy, and particularly North America advocacy. These folks lived in Washington, pushing certain things. At the same time, too, there was a state level strategy, because we all know that policy is not just federal; it's also statewide. So the state construct. So both, I know Gates had a pretty robust team of people who look at the enabling environment to support innovations in our school systems.
Taking that at the local level, it's a highly regulated industry in all of our states. And the more that we engage with leaders on the ground, the more we hear about the ways in which the barriers are legislated. So the fund doesn't do that kind of investment, but we're grateful for the Gateses of the world and the Joyce Foundations of the world that do, because our principals and teacher teams need help knocking down those barriers, and they don't have the time or sort of the interest in spending, all that they would need to spend in Springfield to make that happen. So I think if we're serious about empathetically engaging on the ground, we have to be serious about elevating the barriers that they're bringing forward and ensuring that some of those start to go away.
We have time for one more. We'll try to do a quick lightning round in the next 60 seconds. Jean-Claude, I'm going to throw this one to you. Any favorite ed tech companies that you think are doing great work? You named a few, but any others?
No, I'll get myself into school. We work with a few hundred ed tech companies. But I give some examples. We also have on our website, or ISTE's website, or Project Unicorn, we have a collaboration in vetting ed tech companies. Find out in any one of our websites, you'll find all the ed tech companies we work with, and within to certify them along the lines of learning science, science of development. They're the best among the bunch, we think.
Fantastic. And then Rico, I don't know if I have permission to go to the next one. I know we're at time.
Sure, go for it. Let's do one more. We can
Yeah.
squeeze it in.
I think this is really important and probably didn't spend enough time here, but any thoughts on how to further incorporate students and student voice in philanthropy going forward?
Sure. We are seeding power in our racial equity fund, and so we have brought together students, and we want to bring more, and parents and innovators around the country to decide and truly read the applications we're getting in, make the decisions around who we fund and the criteria that they're looking for in terms of what will make for a strong investment. And so that's just one way that we hope to continue to engaging students, and kind of leverage doing that work across our other strategies as well.
And I think with that, we will have to conclude our session. Thank you again so much. Rico, did you have any final words?
Thank you again so much. All of you, this was an amazing panel, and very insightful. Thank you so much for your time today. Just some notes here for the conference itself. We will have a 30-minute networking session, and Sharice and Sherman here will be able to join us for this to continue this conversation with fellow attendees. I've just posted a link in the chat, I believe, so please join the link if you wish to continue this conversation with our panelists here. And just a quick plug for the rest of the conference, we have one more panel session from 4 o'clock. So please feel free to join our panels. I think we have 3 left today. You can click the reception button on the menu bar to see what's left and what's coming up. So I want to, again, thank you all so much for coming, and thank you everybody who tuned into this panel. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.